In here, I think a little bit. I appreciate you guys. The Pastor Davenport fell working and busted his face all up, so he's at home today. So I told him I would go ahead and take over Sunday school, but we'll do that. Thank you for anybody that's joining us online. We're going to go ahead and do it, even though it's just a few of us in here. For anybody who might be joining us or watching later online. And so today is the last lesson in November. So that's the last lesson in the books, if you got the books over there. And it's entitled, Who is Like God? And I think this is a good lesson because too often when we see struggles in our life, we think those things causing the struggle are the more powerful things, right? Whatever that is, if it's financial problems, if it's substance abuse issues, if it's relationship issues, whatever that is, sometimes we think those are more powerful. And so the verses here in Isaiah are going to tell us today that that's just not the case. And put it into perspective. How big is God? Right? Can you answer that question? How big is God? And we can say things like he created everything, from the smallest subatomic particle to the universe itself. He created all of it. But that doesn't even give it a perspective, I think. And so that's what Isaiah is talking about in these verses. And many Christians are familiar with Isaiah 40. After 39 chapters in the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah is talking about impending judgment and destruction, with only brief periods in that description of hope, the prophet delivered a new message for those who are exiled in Babylon. And that's an important piece of this because he was talking to people that were exiled in Babylon. So they were a nation that had been conquered, they had been dispersed, they had been integrated into a new culture, and they were witness not only to the leadership of that culture, but also to the worship of that culture. And that's what Isaiah is prophesying here. That's what the Lord is saying through Isaiah here, is he's addressing specifically the worship services. And they had a prayer that they did each New Year festival that was to their God. Do either one of you know who the God of the Babylonians were? Have you heard of the god Marduk? That was their god, Marduk. And so every New Year's festival, they would have a prayer where they would ask questions. Who measures the waters of the sea? And then everybody that was in attendance would answer that question with Marduk. And it also was reflected in their creation myth of Enuma Elish. That was how the Babylonians saw creation. Of course, we know creation from the creation story. And in theirs, though, Marduk proclaimed that he measured the shape of Apsu, and Apsu was the freshwater deity. And so knowing that background, it helps us to see what Isaiah was saying in Isaiah 40. And so this is what he said. We'll read through it real quick, and then we'll talk about it. It's Isaiah 40, 12 through 17. I don't have anybody in the control room, so it won't be on the board. But it said, who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? And you can see the resemblance to what they were praying in that prayer, right? Who measured the God of the water? But it says here, who measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Who meted out heaven with a span? Meted is a word that was used for measured, but it means more than measured. It means designed, created, put in place, controlled the heavens with a span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. Of course, there's no answers to these questions, right? Isaiah was asking them rhetorically. The answer to it is no one. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Again, the answer, no one. With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? The answer, of course, still no one. Then he says, behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. And Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beast thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing and vanity. And if you're not in the midst of what the Israelites were going through in their captivity in Babylon, this could be depressing, right? Everything in the eyes of God is nothing. In fact, it's less than nothing. But the questions that they were asking, the prayers that they were uttering was, how are we going to escape this oppression? How are we going to get out from beneath the captivity that we're in? And so Isaiah was telling them, don't worry about the Babylonians, because all the nations of the world are nothing, or less than nothing. And so you might be familiar with that, Isaiah 40. After talking about all the judgment, he's now delivering this new message to those who are exiled in Babylon. One day, in other words, what he was saying, the exile will come to an end and give way to freedom. Right? Don't we look forward to that? When the struggles that we go through will give way to freedom. Most popular are the opening verses of this, which anticipate John the Baptist. They conclude in the assurance of renewed strength. But between all of that and Isaiah is what he says here, the series of poetic remarks about God's character. And so this is one coherent piece, but it's broken up into two sections. And the opening verses contain three sets of rhetorical questions, like I was talking about, the answer to which is no one. And then the later portion contains three sets of statements. So let's talk about those first ones first. Who hath measured the waters in the hollows of his hand? And this passage opening questions assume that there's a cosmic focus, right? Who created the universe? Who created the earth, right? Who put all of this in place? And I think it's interesting. I've been doing a little bit of studying into physics, and I think it's interesting when you look at scientists by nature. Most scientists are atheists, right? They hold faith and science as two opposing viewpoints. But if you look at it, faith and science go hand in hand, really. But most scientists will say science is opposed to faith. But most physicists, the ones that study the workings of the world, the one that studies the laws, right? The first, second law of thermodynamics, the theory of general and special relativity. Those that look at how does the universe work, most of them are Christian, are at least believe in a God. I won't say that most of them are Christian, but most of them believe in intelligent design. One physicist said this: when you start your career in science, when you start to drink the cup of science, you're an atheist. But what awaits you at the bottom of that cup is God. And I think that's interesting to see when those that know the most about how the universe works. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But I think it's interesting just to know that. And so in this opening passages, we're looking at a cosmic focus, attending to God's universe, his will and his knowledge in both the images of creation in Genesis. In fact, the same order that we see here in Isaiah is the order that was in the creation story. The prophet's questions are rhetorical. He didn't need to provide an answer. To Isaiah and his audience, the response was clear. Only the God of Israel enjoys dominion. No one can access his will or his knowledge. So the first set of questions explores the expanse of the created order. Using parallel questions, Isaiah asked, who had measured the great dimensions of the cosmos? Now, by offering contrasting elements of creation, the prophet effectively considers all of the universe, right? So he's not just asking specific questions, but in the totality of it, he's asking who created everything that was created. His questions range from the water to the sky to the dust of the earth to the mountains. All of creation is under God's dominion. So underlying verse 12's cosmic survey is the theology of creation. And lots of people kind of recoil away from the word theology. But all theology is, does either one of you know what theology means? No? Anything with O-G-Y at the end of it is the study of, right? So biology, cosmology, all of those are just the study of. So theology is theos and then study of, right? So it's a study of God. That's all it is, right? But our understanding of God is what we say is the frame of our theology. And what Isaiah is talking about here, the questions that he's asking, are a way of helping people understand the theology or the study of God in creation. And it's the same order, right? Isaiah progressed from waters to sky to earth. That's the same order that we see in creation. And then if we go back to lesson 1 of this whole book, right, which started a couple months ago, the Old Testament offers the story of creation, which is distinct. It's not the same as other creation stories. So we talked about the creation story in Marduk and what they say about creation, but that's a myth. And lots of cultures have myths of creation. And if you look at the specifics of those creation myths, they're very similar. I mean, they're similar to the story of creation, but not because they're all myths, but because the story of creation is the truth. And so those myths come out of what was known, right? And then they put their own spin on it. And so in the first lesson of this series, we talked about the creation story and how it's distinct from the myths of the Near East. And the distinctions between those two become most clear in times of oppression. So we might be talking about the Israelites and how they're oppressed under Babylon now, but we can apply that to our own lives, right? And we'll talk about that in the sermon today if anybody shows up for church. In the times that we're struggling, in the times that we don't know the answer, that's when we start looking for the answer and become susceptible to things that sound right, things that feel good, right? If it makes me feel better, well, that must be the truth. And so it's important to look within those things at those times to discover what the truth really is. And what's the measuring stick? Right? If we hear somebody proclaim something as true spiritually, what's the measuring stick? How do we know if it is? Any ideas? That's right. The Word of God is in the Bible, right? If it's not consistent with what's written in the Word, then it's not true. Even if it makes us feel good, it's still not true, right? And so that's the importance of what Isaiah is doing here. Many believe that the military conquest reflected the superiority of the victor's God over theirs. So in the times, a lot of Israelites were saying, God, where are you? Right? We're under oppression. We've been conquered. So does that mean that their gods are more powerful than our God? And the Jews exiting 70 years of exile bore the burden of that ancient theology, right? Whoever wins the war, their God is more powerful. And many of them were undoubtedly wrestling with the notion that Babylon's Marduk, who they were praying to, was a greater than Israel's Yahweh. But Isaiah, however, left no room for that. So what he was saying here to them is, don't think that Marduk is greater than Yahweh. There's absolutely no room for this. And so he was asking the same questions that they said in their prayer. Who measured the waters in the hollows of his hand? Not only did he measure the waters, but God is so great that all of the waters of the earth would fit into the palm of his hand. Who meted out the heavens with a span? Not only did he create the heavens, but he's the one that designed and controls everything that was created. And that's what he was saying to these people that were in Israel. Who measured out the waters of his hand? Although they echo the words that they were praying to Marduk, the text does just the opposite. It creates a question in the passage. The implied answer, of course, is no one. So they were saying, who measures the water god? Marduk. And Isaiah was saying, who measures all of the waters in the palm of their hand? No one. Only Yahweh exercises dominion and counsel. No one is comparable to God, including the assemblies of gods revered around by the surrounding people and groups. And so we can go through all those questions, right? Who has weighed the mountains in the scales and the hills in the balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, being his counselor, hath taught him? We see those same questions when Job goes through his struggles, right? Job was complaining to God about what he was going through, and God said, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And Isaiah is saying these same things, right? You think Marduk is so great. Who is it that directed the Spirit of the Lord? Who is it that counsels the Lord? They were teaching in their religion that there was a spiritual council that all got together and decided what was going to happen next. And so Isaiah was saying, who is it that counsels the Lord? With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him and taught him in the path of judgment, taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? Who is it that told God how to do all this stuff? No one. He didn't need to be taught because he knows all things and he's all powerful. And then we turn from those rhetorical questions that say no one is more powerful than God to questions about the specific nations. He says, behold, the nations are a drop in the bucket. Janie had a bucket in the back of her truck the other day, and it had some tools in it. It had a sprayer, a paint sprayer, and some other things. You know how much it rained. That bucket had filled up with water. And I thought, we better empty that out or all those tools are going to rust. And so I emptied it out. But once I poured all the water out, was it dry on the inside? No, it had drops of water in it, right? But those drops of water meant nothing. So I didn't bother taking a rag and wiping them out. The only thing I wanted to do was to get the water off of the tools. And that's what Isaiah is saying here. The nations are just a drop in the bucket. It means nothing. We wouldn't even spend the time to wipe out that water drop. Just one drop in the bucket, all of the nations of the earth in comparison to God. He says they're counted as the small dust of the balance. So in those days when they wanted to sell precious metals or they wanted to sell wheat or flour, they would weigh it in a balance. But if there was some dust on the other side of the balance, it wouldn't even affect the balance at all. It means nothing. That's what he's saying. They're counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. So all of the nations are just a dust in the balance. But the isles that are away from the nations, those are even less than that. And so he's putting it in perspective for the people that were in captivity in Israel, in Babylon, not to worry, because God was greater than even those that were holding them captive. Now, Lebanon, all of the timbers that were used to build King Solomon's temple came from Lebanon. It was known for huge timbers. I think they were redwood, if I'm not mistaken. And so all of those timbers were felled, they were hewn, they were numbered, and then they were dragged in to the coast of Joppa and then carried overland to build the temple. So Lebanon was a great place. It's spoken of with positivity throughout the Bible. And without Lebanon, they couldn't have built the temple. Not only did it have those great timbers, but it had lots of animals that were perfect, without blemish, that they used for the sacrifices. And then, so that the audience would have known this, right? They would have known all of this about Lebanon. And Isaiah says, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beast thereof sufficient for the burnt offering. So all of the timbers in Lebanon aren't sufficient to burn on the altar. All of the animals, not just the perfect animals, but all of the animals, even the imperfect ones, all together aren't enough to offer burnt offerings to God. That's how great he is. And then he finally says, and all nations before him are as nothing. They are counted to him as less than nothing, as vanity. And so that should give us a perspective of how great God is. And that should put our problems or our concerns in context, right? Are we worried about anything today? About what tomorrow might bring? Right? I mean, we're looking for to be approved for certain things, right? To be delivered from certain things, and sometimes it concerns us on how that outcome's going to come out. I was counting on something just the other day, and I got a letter. It was on my desk when I got back, and it was declined. So, when we put our hope in something man-made, when we put our hope in men, we can be disappointed. And what God's telling us through Isaiah today is, don't let that be disappointing. Don't let it be discouraging, because even if it looks like it's a step backwards, even if it looks like it's a block in the road, none of that is greater than me. And if we've put our faith in him, then we should feel confident that he'll see us through. Does that make sense? Is it helpful at all? Let's see. In the face of challenges, we should remember that God holds the world in his hand. We can never try to manipulate God. Instead, we should rest in the comfort that what God has planned will come to pass. And we'll talk a little bit about knowing what it is that he planned. You know, Jeremiah 29:11 says, I know the plans that I have for you, the plans to prosper you. Right? I forget exactly what it says. But it's not for us to know what those plans are. It's just to trust in the one who does. God is the source of wisdom. We should seek his guidance in all that we do. In fact, in the story of creation, it tells us that wisdom was there. Right? In the beginning was the word, logos, or wisdom. The word was with God, and the word was God. Now, wisdom didn't do the creation, but wisdom was there, which is why he didn't need counsel. He didn't need instruction because the wisdom was already there. God's the source of that wisdom, and so we should seek his guidance. When we are burdened by politics, we can rest assured that God is greater than the nations. God is far greater than anything that the world can offer. No obstacle can ever stand in God's way. He counts even the nations as nothing. So one of the questions that I think we can consider is if even the cosmos are minute to God, right? So even if the cosmos mean nothing, because this message on itself, without understanding what came behind it, could be something that causes despair, right? To know that we're nothing before God. But the reality is that he still loves us so much that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish. So even if the cosmos is minute to God, how can God therefore be personal to us? Right? How could that be the case? And that, that can only be possible if he's a personal, intelligent, creative being. Isaiah stated that no one can understand God's mind. How then can Christians know God's will in their life? How has God revealed himself to us? That's a question that all of us should want to answer, right? How can we know his will? And, one of the things that I look back on in my life, we used to go to a flea market, and we had a table, and so we would hand people Bibles and gospel tracts as they walked by. And right across the aisle from us, not on the same aisle, but the next one over, was a table from a mosque, and they were handing out Qurans and, literature about Islam. And I remember sitting there one day, and I had a Bible that I was using. It was on Saturdays that we would go, so I had to prepare for Sunday to preach, and I had a Bible with me that I was studying from. It was a Jesus study Bible. And so all these study Bibles, there's men's studies Bibles and women's study Bibles. This one was a Jesus study Bible. And so it explained how every page pointed to Christ. And so I liked this. It was a hardcover. It was a really nice Bible. And I just felt the urge to go give it to the people at the table from the mosque. They had come over earlier in that day and picked up one of everything that we had. And that's one way I think we can identify the will of God. If we're desirous to follow his will, if we put our trust and our faith in him, then we'll have those urges based on the Holy Spirit to do those things. Now, I had no idea what God was going to do with that. I still don't know what he did with that. I know that the people that when I went over and gave it to them, they took it and they were appreciative. And then I never saw them again. So I'm hoping that they ended up accepting Christ and leaving Islam, but I don't know. God doesn't always reveal the end of what it is that he's asked us to do. He told Abraham, leave your family and go to a place that I will show you, right? And so the point of that is no one can understand God's mind, but we can be obedient to the things that he calls us to do. That's how I think we can live as Christians in our life. And I know both of you have had those urges before, right? And maybe they're unexplained. Why do I want to do this? And if it lines up with the Bible, that's the key, right? We need to have a desire to do his will, and it needs to line up with Scripture. And then we just obey that urge and leave the results to God. All the animals of Lebanon were insufficient for sacrifice. So what impact does that have on sacrifice? What does that say about the gravity of Christ's sacrifice? At that time, they were in the process of sacrificing animals for the forgiveness of sin. But Jesus said, I am the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so God says there isn't enough animals in all of the world to satisfy the debt that we owe for our sin. But Jesus is enough, right? He's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. If God counts the nations as nothing, then does he care about the political affairs of the world? What do you think? Does he care about politics, God? What's that? Yeah, I mean, I think he uses it, right? He would get right. That's right. Yeah. But I think in reality, it's like a chess game, right? Even Nebuchadnezzar, he was using for his purposes of showing Israel where they were wrong and disobeying. And so the Bible tells us clearly that anybody that has a position of power was put there by God. And so not that he cares about politics necessarily, but he uses politics in order to accomplish his will. How should Christians approach governments and their nations? Paul tells us a lot about that, right? That we should obey. In fact, I said, who should we give our money to? Should we give it to Caesar or should we give it to you? In our day, we could ask the question when we tithe, do we tithe based on our gross income or our net income, right? And Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's, right? And so as Christians, we should live peaceably under the government. Of course, we can protest unlawful, unconstitutional acts, immoral acts, injustices. What's that? Intelligently, right? Yeah. That's right. Yeah, not the dumb stuff, right? Not so-called injustice when it's just trying to get benefits for myself. Yeah. That's right. We shouldn't be doing that. Do what? Everybody's got their own opinion. That's right. That's right. But we should do what we can to live peaceably within the government restrictions. And this he was saying at a time when they were under Roman rule, right? And so we shouldn't go out of our way to break the law, right? We know what happens when we do, right? Eventually we get caught and we get, and the point of that is what we want to do is to be that light unto the world, right? We don't want to do anything that would give people a reason to criticize us as Christians. And it goes as far as to say we don't want to do anything that even looks evil, that even resembles evil, so that people can say anything against us. They're going to anyway. But the worst thing that can happen is when they do, we prove them right. And so that's how Paul suggests that we live within government. But government's not where we get our hope, right? And it's nice that we have government programs that can help and the food stamp program and all that stuff, but we shouldn't put our hope and our trust and our faith in those programs, because ultimately God's the one that's in control, and we should put our faith and trust in him. In Isaiah 40:12, it says, he weighed the mountains in scales. It's impossible for us to be sure about how much mountains weigh. We can estimate the weight of mountains, though, based on the size and the types of rock that we might think that are inside. But without knowing exactly what the composition of the mountain is, which no one can, it can only be an estimate. But scientists have estimated that Mount Everest, you guys have any idea? How much do you think Mount Everest would weigh if we could cut it off the earth and put it on a scale? The estimates are 357 trillion pounds. Can you imagine that? I can't even think about that. 357 trillion pounds. This is far more than the weight of every human being on earth added together. Even if we include Jimmy in that, right? We put everybody together. That's far more than what the weight of every single human being is added together. But what we can only estimate, God considers dust. Think about that. 357 trillion pounds, God calls that just dust in the scale. In verse 14, he said, who instructed him? Isaiah made it clear that no one can match the mind of God. No one can tell God what to do. No one can show God where he's wrong, right? He's perfect every time, every decision that he makes. In fact, he's the definition of truth, right? Wouldn't it be nice if whatever we said was true because we said it? That's the way God is. It's not, there's no measuring stick against what he says is true. It's true because he said it. That's what makes it true. Now, what we say is true when it lines up with what he said, but he's the one that utters truth. And so no one can match his mind. He is the infinite creator. We can never fully understand him or his ways. And that's why it says in Psalm 2, I think in verse 3, it says, lean not on your own understanding, but trust in the Lord with all your heart. Augustine put it this way, to touch God a little with our mind is a great blessing. To grasp him is impossible. Praise God that through Christ we can grasp him even a little. And then we talked about Lebanon already with the not being sufficient to burn. Scientists estimate that the earth is home to over 3 trillion trees. With all the paper mills, we were driving back home from Arkansas. You know, if you guys know anything about Arkansas, you'll know Ashdown has a paper mill in there. And it was kind of amazing. Tori has a pretty good nose because as we were approaching Ashdown, she said, what's that smell? You know, we were still several miles north of Ashdown. And then the paper mill is at the south part of Ashdown. So before we even came close, she says, what's that smell? It smells, and she was saying it smells like a rendering plant or, you know, a dead animal. She said, what is that? You know, and I didn't smell it. And so it didn't immediately hit me. But as we traveled, I said, I don't know what it is. I'm looking around to see if there was any dead animal on the road or something. But as we got closer to Ashdown, then I smelled it. And I'm very familiar with the paper mill smell. So as soon as I smelled it, I said, oh, that's the paper mill. And then, of course, I got to show it to her. You know, so with all the paper mills that we have, people say the trees are getting less, but I think the paper companies, they know where their bread is buttered. One of the things I used to do inspections at paper mills when I was working for insurance companies, and we were in there one time, and our job as insurance inspectors was to give them recommendations. You might have met these guys, Jimmy, in your career, right? So we would go in there and we would find something that we thought might produce a loss. And we would say, here's what we recommend you do in order to prevent that loss. So it could be maintenance, it could be some other things. And we had a whole list of recommendations that was going to be really expensive. And one of the guys in the meetings from the paper mill said, what do you think, money grows on trees? Right? That's a pretty common statement, right? Money doesn't grow on trees. But at a paper mill, it kind of does, right? Because that's how they get their money is the trees. And so I think in reality, even though the environmentalists want to tell us that they're using up trees, in reality, they plant more trees than they take, right? So the net number of trees is going up. Now, one criticism that might be true is they're using hardwoods and planting softwoods, but ultimately they're harvesting now the trees that they themselves planted and not continuing to take other areas. But science has estimated that we have over 3 trillion trees. That's over 400 trees per person. So for every person, there's 400 trees. That's 1,200 trees represented just in this room today. Today, some of the countries with the highest density of trees are Sweden, Taiwan, Slovenia, French Guinea, or Guyana. In the ancient Near East, however, Lebanon is the place that wins the prize. The coastal mountain region was replete with wildlife, copper, iron, and wine. Its forests yielded pine, fir, cypress, and cedar. Yeah, did I say cedar trees earlier? I might have said redwood, but cedar trees are what was used to build the temple. The wealth of timber drew nations throughout the Near East. Cedar from the region was primary building materials for the temple, like I said. Yet even the mighty forest and its beasts could not offer enough for the offerings that were required to the Lord, who is infinitely greater than anything that we can imagine. So there's more that we could say, but I think the overall lesson here, right, when we think about how big God is in connection with the world that He created, we can't help but worship Him, right? We can't help but submit our will to His. God is great and mighty, ruling over even those who don't believe in Him. And that's a misnomer that we feel like sometimes, right? If we don't believe in Him, then I don't have to listen to Him. But the ultimate reality, the ultimate truth is that He rules over all of His creation, even those who don't believe in Him. He's completely self-sufficient, and no power is worth comparing to Him. We should willingly worship, serve, and submit to the great and powerful God of the Bible, Yahweh. There's no other reasonable thing to do than to do that. And so that'll conclude our Sunday school lesson today, and it'll conclude the book that we're in. And so next week we'll start a brand new book. But unless our attendance grows, I'm going to probably stop buying the Sunday school books because it costs us about $100 a quarter to buy all these Sunday school books. And so we'll have them because they're already ordered and in for December, January, and February. But we'll see what happens throughout the first of the year on whether we reorder those books or not. So, all right. Well, we do have coffee and donuts in the back, so you can join us or do whatever it is you do in between time, and then hopefully we'll get some people to show up for church, which will start in about 25 minutes. All right. Thank you, guys.